Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. This is the third video in the reproduction unit, and we're looking at female hormone regulation. So the nice thing for us to start is the hormone regulation is really similar to the males to get started. We still have our hypothalamus stimulating our anterior pituitary through the use of GnRH. And what that is doing is it's causing our anterior pituitary, like we discussed last time, to produce two hormones, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. But the end result of these ones, unlike the male, are going to be a little bit different. Alright, so make sure you get that written down there. Same as last time. So when we're looking at the hormones, let's just recap what they do. So before in males, they were FSH was meant to stimulate sperm production. Well, this time what it's going to be responsible is this thing called the follicular phase, which we're going to get back into a little bit later. So just a little asterisk here, we'll come back to this, but write it down because you're going to want it when you're comparing later. So the FSH stimulates the maturation or maturing of the ovum, which is the egg, inside the ovary. So it's similar in the males as in the males where it's producing sperm. This time it's producing, well, mature eggs. So it stimulates the follicle. So this is within the ovary, within the follicle, there's your ovum. Whereas LH, instead of testosterone production like in the male, it's going to secrete progesterone and estrogen. And both of these ones have specific functions, which we'll get into in a minute. More specifically, remember the corpus luteum, we talked about it before, it's just going to be leftover follicular tissue that has a certain function. Well, that's the function. It's going to start producing these two hormones. So let's talk about what each of the hormones do. This controls the secretory phase. Again, you're going to see this in a few minutes, so just asterisk it for now. We'll come back to it. But more importantly, what happens progesterone? It causes the maturing, can't spell again, of the endometrium, which was the inner lining of the uterus. And it also contributes to breast development, along with estrogen, which we'll see next. Okay, endometrium. Moving along, our estrogen hormone, this is controlling the proliferative phase. Proliferation just means the making of something, building up. So don't forget, we'll see this again later. So remember this, we'll come back to it. But what this does, estrogen, it builds the endometrium. Whereas the progesterone causes it to be mature. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. But the endometrium needs to be built up in order for implantation to occur. And that's what the estrogen is going to do. It also causes some stimulation, some maturation of the ovum, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes. Development of the sex characteristics, just like men. And what those characteristics are going to be, it makes women fat and hairy. Just kidding. But it definitely contributes to the fat development and the hair distribution. Also, the growth of the uterus and the vagina, and like we were saying with the progesterone, also breast development. All right, moving along here, continuing with estrogen. When it gets too high, so as estrogen starts to increase, it causes homeostasis to get out of whack, and so it begins to come back down again. And that's because of negative feedback on the anterior pituitary. So it's a negative feedback loop, just like testosterone was. And it does that because it causes the LH and FH to be shut down, and a decrease in that leads to a decrease in estrogen levels. All right, on day 14, this is when ovulation occurs, and so what they think is responsible for it is this big peak, so the highest level of estrogen. If you look, at the same time that high peak, there's a huge spike in LH. And what that LH does is it causes the ovary to cause the follicle to rupture and release the ovum. Okay, so it's directly related. So estrogen increases to its highest level before it starts coming back down again, causes this spike, which results in ovulation. Okay, so this is what happens for ovulation. So the corpus luteum, as we've said before, is the leftover tissue after ovulation has occurred. It's got some significant functions. So let's talk about it again first, what it is. So it's the remaining follicular tissue. And what it does is it secretes chemicals, secretes hormones. So it secretes progesterone. I'll actually get that spelled correctly for you guys. Progesterone and estrogen. Reminder what those do: causes the endometrium to mature and become secretory, which means secrete mucus, and estrogen would be the thickening of the endometrium. Okay, and this lasts for about the corpus luteum, once this is happening, it's all great. But if pregnancy doesn't occur, so if implantation doesn't occur, it causes these corpus luteum to break down. So it breaks down. And if it breaks down, there's no more of this. And if there's no more thickening and maturing, it causes menstruation to happen. And menstruation is just the shedding of the endometrium. And it lasts about 5 days. And then after those 5 days, the anterior pituitary starts up again and starts a new cycle. Because the anterior pituitary starts releasing FSH and LH again. Okay, so we're almost done. We just want to compare these little tables here. So what happens, reminder about the ovarian cycle, FSH and LH are going to be secreted by the anterior pituitary. It causes the maturation of the follicle. So that's why it's called the follicular phase. Excuse me. Ovulation day 14, the ovary releases the ovum. Corpus luteum is formed, which leads us, luteum, causes us into the luteal phase, which means that the estrogen and progesterone are going to be formed, which have the functions on the uterus, which we talked about. Moving on, remember, this is a big aspect. Everything that's happening in the ovarian phase is going to have direct implication on the uterine phase, because the hormones that are produced here are going to impact what's happening there. So let's get into that. So the uterine cycle, so the first phase, so this is directly responsible if there's no pregnancy occurring. If there's no pregnancy occurring, what's going to happen is the endometrium lining is shed. And this is called menstruation. Oh my goodness. And it lasts about 1 to 5 days. This brings us into the proliferative phase. So this is when we have to start building up the uterus again for the hope of implantation. So this is where it gets rebuilt and thickened. And so this is the endometrium again. And finally, here the secretory phase, it continues to be thickened and also matured, which causes it to be secretory to release the mucus, endometrium. And let's just finish off with just a recap of the key ideas. Key ideas: the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary control the ovary through hormones. And the ovary ripens egg and release on day 14. The ovary secretes estrogen, proestrogen through the corpus luteum, and that causes the uterus to become thickened and mature as a result of those two hormones. So if you guys take a peek at this again, we'll go over this a bit in class because it's nice to see how everything's connected. So these are the hormones that are released by the brain, and what they do is they have certain impacts on the ovary, which have certain hormones being produced, and they have certain impacts on the uterine lining. Okay, so make sure if you have any questions to write them down. There should be quite a few, but hopefully this was a nice little intro and we'll go into lots of stuff, lots of detail in class.